The dinner rush always began the same way. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers settled over polished tables, quiet piano music drifted through the room, and the scent of fresh rosemary, butter, and baked bread filled the air. Guests arrived wearing expensive watches, tailored jackets, and practiced smiles. They came to celebrate promotions, anniversaries, and victories that seemed far away from the life I knew. I tied my apron, straightened my name tag, and reminded myself to smile. Some nights, that was the hardest part of the job. My name is Nolan Hayes, and for the past 4 years I had worked as a waiter at Hawthorne House, one of the most respected restaurants in Chicago. The tips were generous, the expectations were high, and every evening demanded the same quiet performance. Be invisible. Never let your own troubles reach the table. Most guests never noticed the people carrying their meals. They remembered the wine, the music, and the dessert. They rarely remembered the hands that served them. I never blamed them. Everyone carried something heavy. Mine simply happened to follow me everywhere. My father had passed away 3 years earlier. Cancer had taken him slowly, but it never stole his gentleness. Even during the hardest days, he found ways to smile at strangers and ask whether they had eaten. He believed kindness mattered most when life became unfair. He had raised me alone. Whenever I asked about my other parent or the years before I was born, he always answered with the same quiet smile. Some stories belong to yesterday, Nolan. Live for tomorrow. As a child, I accepted those words. As an adult, they became the question that never stopped echoing inside me. Who had my father been before he became simply Dad? The restaurant manager interrupted my thoughts. Nolan. I looked up. Caleb Sutton stood beside the service station with today's reservation list in his hand. Caleb had become more than a manager. He was the closest thing I had to family after my father's death. Private guest tonight, he said quietly. Important. He laughed softly. When security checks the kitchen before dinner, I'd say yes. I smiled. So, another celebrity? Worse. He lowered his voice. A billionaire. I raised an eyebrow. I'll try not to spill soup on him. Please don't. For the first time that evening, Caleb looked genuinely nervous. The owner requested our best service. An older man emerged slowly. His silver hair caught the warm lights outside. He wore a navy coat instead of an expensive designer jacket. There was nothing loud about him. No flashy jewelry. No dramatic entrance. Yet every person near the doorway instinctively stepped aside. Power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply walked into a room. That's Graham Mercer, Caleb whispered. I had heard the name before. Everyone had. One of America's most successful businessmen. Owner of charities, companies, and buildings that seemed to touch every city skyline. People described him as brilliant, private, almost impossible to know. As Graham entered the dining room, he briefly looked around before taking his reserved table near the windows. For one strange moment, his eyes met mine. There was nothing unusual about it. Yet something inside me shifted. Not fear. Not admiration. Only the strange feeling that I had seen sadness like his before. I couldn't explain why. I approached with 2 glasses of water. Good evening, sir. He thanked me politely. His voice was calm, almost gentle. Throughout dinner he remained quiet, speaking only with the lawyer seated across from him. Still, every now and then, I noticed him looking toward me. Not in the uncomfortable way some wealthy guests stared. More like someone trying to remember a forgotten song. When I returned with the tray, his lawyer had already left. Mr. Mercer sat alone beside the window. Rain had begun tapping softly against the glass. I placed the cup before him. Would you like anything else, sir? Instead of answering, he looked at my name tag. Nolan. Yes, sir. Hayes. His voice became quieter. That's your surname? Yes. He nodded slowly. Would you mind staying for a moment? My shift was busy, but something about his expression made it impossible to refuse. I don't mind. He studied my face longer than most strangers ever would. Then he asked a question no customer had ever asked me. Was your father's name Julian Hayes? The room suddenly felt smaller. I blinked. Yes. His fingers tightened around the coffee cup. For several seconds he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried years of silence. I haven't heard that name in over 25 years. My heart began beating faster. You knew him? Instead of answering, he stood carefully. If you have 10 minutes after your shift. He hesitated. Would you come upstairs to my office? I looked toward Caleb. He gave a small nod from across the room. Apparently, this meeting had already been approved. Nearly an hour later, after the last guests had gone home, I found myself following Graham Mercer through a quiet private elevator. Above it stood the headquarters of Mercer Holdings. The executive offices were silent. Soft lamps illuminated polished wooden floors. Everything felt elegant without trying to impress. Graham opened one final door. This has been my office for 20 years. He invited me inside. Old books. Then my eyes stopped. A framed black and white photograph rested on the corner of his desk. Two young men stood beside a quiet lake. One smiled toward the camera. The other looked only at him. The smiling man wore a familiar expression. One I had seen every day growing up. My father's smile. The same gentle eyes. The same crooked grin. The same tiny scar above his eyebrow. My hands began trembling. The air seemed to disappear from the room. I stepped closer. There could be no mistake. The young man in that photograph was Julian Hayes, my father. Behind me I heard footsteps. Graham returned carrying 2 cups of coffee. Without taking my eyes from the portrait, I whispered, "Sir." He stopped walking. "Why is my father in your office?" The porcelain cup slipped from his hand. It shattered across the polished floor. Neither of us moved. His face lost every trace of color. His eyes filled with tears that seemed to belong to another lifetime. He looked from the broken cup to the photograph, then back to me. His lips, I thought. His voice broke completely. I thought I'd never see those eyes again. In that silent office, surrounded by memories neither of us yet understood, I realized the portrait wasn't simply decoration. It was a doorway into a past my father had taken to his grave. And somehow, I had just stepped through it. The broken coffee cup remained untouched. Neither of us seemed to notice the dark liquid spreading across the polished floor. Graham Mercer stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the photograph that had silently guarded his desk for more than 2 decades. I had expected an explanation, perhaps an old business connection or a forgotten friendship. Instead, I saw grief. Not fresh grief. The kind that had settled deep into someone's heart until it became part of the way they breathed. After several quiet moments, Graham bent down to collect the broken pieces of porcelain. "You shouldn't do that," I said softly. "You'll cut yourself." He gave me a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "I've lived with sharper things than this." The words settled heavily between us. "Please," he said. "Sit." I obeyed. Outside, rain continued to tap gently against the tall windows, wrapping the office in a peaceful silence that somehow made every heartbeat louder. Graham carried the framed photograph with both hands before sitting opposite me. He looked at it for a long time. Then he finally spoke. "Your father wasn't simply someone I knew." His voice shook. "He was the love of my life." The room disappeared around me. Every sound faded except the quiet ticking of the old clock hanging above the bookshelf. I stared at him, unable to answer. My father had never spoken about loving another man. He had never spoken about loving anyone. Graham seemed to understand the confusion on my face. "I imagine this isn't what you expected to hear." I slowly shook my head. "No." He nodded. "I didn't expect to tell anyone." His fingers gently brushed the edge of the old photograph. "We were 22. I met Julian at the public library." A faint smile finally appeared. "I was pretending to study economics. And he was actually studying." Despite everything, a small laugh escaped me. Graham smiled too. He caught me watching him instead of reading. His expression softened with the memory. He walked over, closed my book, and asked why I'd spend an hour on the same page. I could almost picture my father doing exactly that. He always noticed people, I whispered. He noticed everyone. Graham nodded. Especially lonely people. For the next hour, he unfolded a life I had never imagined. He and Julian had become friends before either admitted what their feelings meant. They wandered through bookstores on quiet weekends, shared sandwiches in city parks, talked until sunrise in tiny cafes that no longer existed. There were no grand declarations, only thousands of ordinary moments that slowly became extraordinary because they belonged to each other. In those days, Graham said quietly, the world wasn't kind to men like us. I listened carefully. So we learned to be careful. They rarely held hands outside. Letters became safer than phone calls. Long walks after sunset became their favorite place to speak honestly. Yet despite the fear surrounding them, Graham described those years as the happiest of his life. I thought love was enough. His smile faded. I was wrong. Inside rested several worn journals tied together with a faded blue ribbon. He placed them gently on the table between us. I've written almost every day since Julian disappeared. I looked at the notebooks. You kept all of them? I couldn't let the memories disappear too. Carefully, he opened the oldest journal. Inside were photographs, movie tickets, pressed autumn leaves, a receipt from a tiny diner dated 26 years earlier. My father appeared again and again, smiling exactly as I remembered him. Young, hopeful, completely alive. Then Graham unfolded something wrapped inside one of the pages. A small silver ring. I bought this 6 months before everything ended. His voice became almost a whisper. I wanted to ask him to spend his life with me. I looked up. You were going to propose? Yes. His answer came without hesitation. I had already chosen the place. He described a quiet lakeside where they often watched the sunset. He planned to ask Julian there on the first weekend of October. Instead, Julian never arrived. I waited for 6 hours. The fire crackled softly. I thought he'd been delayed. Another silence. Then I thought he'd changed his mind. He swallowed carefully. 3 days later, I received a letter. He reached into the journal and removed an envelope that looked worn with age. Inside was a single page. The handwriting wasn't my father's. I know that now, Graham said. But I didn't then. The letter claimed Julian had left willingly. It said he had realized love could never compete with Graham's growing business empire. It asked Graham never to look for him. I believed every word. My chest tightened. My father would never write something so cold. I know. Graham closed his eyes. I know that now. He admitted he had searched for months despite the letter. Hospitals. Old friends. Neighbors. Even distant relatives. No one seemed to know where Julian had gone. Eventually, Graham convinced himself the letter had been truthful. The pain became something he buried beneath work. Company after company. Building after building. The world called him brilliant. No one realized he was simply trying to stay too busy to remember. I looked down at the old photographs scattered across the table. My father never stopped wearing this watch. I pointed toward one picture. Graham smiled sadly. It was my birthday gift to him. Another piece of my father's quiet life suddenly made sense. For years I had watched him carefully wind that old watch every morning. He never explained why it mattered so much. He never needed to. Love had already explained it. A heavy silence settled again. Finally, I asked the question growing inside me. If you thought he left, why keep all of this? Graham answered almost immediately. Because my heart never believed the letter. His voice cracked. My mind accepted it. But my heart waited anyway. Tears blurred my vision. For 26 years, two people had loved each other while believing they had been abandoned. The cruelty of it felt impossible. Graham slowly reached into the bottom drawer of his desk. This is why I asked you to stay tonight. He removed one final envelope. Unlike everything else, it had never been opened. My name wasn't written on it. Neither was Graham's. Only 2 words appeared across the front in familiar handwriting. For Julian. Graham stared at the envelope as though he had feared touching it for decades. It was found among my sister Brooke's belongings after she moved out of our family home. His expression darkened. She claimed she had forgotten it existed. He looked directly into my eyes. For years, I wanted to believe that. His voice lowered. But I don't believe it anymore. A chill ran through me. Something inside that unopened envelope was about to change everything either of us believed about the past. And for the first time that night, I realized this wasn't simply a story about lost love. It was beginning to look like a story about betrayal. Neither of us reached for the envelope at first. Graham looked at the envelope with the same expression a person might wear before opening a door that had haunted every dream. "I've imagined what this letter might say 1,000 times," he whispered. "And now?" I asked. He let out a slow breath. "Now I'm afraid to know." I understood that feeling. Sometimes the truth healed. Sometimes it reopened wounds we had barely learned to survive. Graham carefully slid a letter opener beneath the fragile seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the handwriting was unmistakably familiar. It was my father's. My chest tightened. I had seen those careful, steady letters on birthday cards, grocery lists, and little notes he left beside my breakfast before school. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Graham handed the letter to me. "I think he wanted you to hear his voice first." The first sentence blurred through my tears. "My dearest Graham." I closed my eyes. My father had written those words with love that had never faded. When I found the strength to continue, every sentence seemed to carry the weight of 26 silent years. He wrote that he had never chosen to leave. He explained that strange letters had arrived, each claiming Graham no longer wanted a future with him. One letter insisted Graham's family believed their relationship would destroy the Mercer name. Another claimed Graham had accepted an arranged marriage to protect his growing business. My father confessed that he had believed those lies because they came one after another, each sounding more convincing than the last. He had waited for Graham to come. He had waited until hope became too painful. Tears rolled silently down my face. Across the desk, Graham covered his mouth with one shaking hand. The letter continued. Years later, after learning he was seriously ill, my father discovered that the letters had been false. A mutual friend had accidentally revealed that Graham had spent months searching for him. By then, shame had already built a prison around his heart. He believed too much time had passed. He believed Graham had finally found peace. Instead of returning, he chose silence. The final paragraphs were written more slowly. The handwriting grew weaker. "If this letter ever reaches you, please know that loving you was never my greatest mistake. Losing faith was." I stopped reading. The room became painfully quiet. Graham bowed his head. His shoulders trembled with grief that had waited decades for permission to exist. "I know. I loved him every single day. I know." For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Words suddenly felt too small for everything that had been stolen. When Graham finally lifted his head, tears still rested in his eyes. "He raised you alone?" I nodded. "He worked as a high school art teacher." A gentle smile found my face despite everything. "He never earned much, but somehow every birthday felt magical." "What was he like at home?" I laughed softly through my tears. "He sang while cooking." Graham smiled immediately. "He always sang. He couldn't keep houseplants alive. He never could. He loved old movies. He made me watch the same ones every winter." For the first time that evening, we weren't talking about loss. We were talking about Julian. Not the mystery. Not the tragedy. Simply the man we had both loved in different ways. Felt strangely comforting. Graham walked toward one of the bookshelves and removed a small wooden box. Inside rested dozens of photographs I had never seen before. One showed my father laughing as wind pushed his hair across his forehead. Another captured him reading beneath a tree. One picture stopped me completely. My father was looking at Graham with quiet affection. He wasn't smiling toward the camera. He was smiling at the man beside him. It was the happiest I had ever seen him. Late that afternoon we stood outside the little house where I had grown up. The garden was smaller than I remembered. The porch swing still moved gently in the breeze. Graham looked toward the front door for a long time. I should have been here. You didn't know where he was. I should have tried harder. I placed a hand on his shoulder. My father spent his whole life believing you had stopped loving him. And you spent your whole life believing he had left. We were all robbed. He closed his eyes. I don't know how to forgive myself. Before I could answer, another car slowly pulled into the driveway. A woman stepped out. Elegant. Composed. Yet visibly nervous. Graham's expression changed instantly. Brooke. She looked at both of us before lowering her eyes. I've been searching for you. Neither of us spoke. She took one hesitant step forward. There are things neither of you knows. The evening breeze suddenly felt colder. Whatever remained hidden in the past had finally arrived at our doorstep. And judging by the fear in Brooke's eyes, the truth was even darker than either of us had imagined. The three of us stood in silence. The old porch creaked softly beneath our feet, and the evening breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass through the quiet neighborhood. For years, this small house had been the safest place I knew. Now it felt as though every hidden memory had gathered here, waiting to be heard. Brooke Mercer looked nothing like the powerful woman the business magazines often described. Her shoulders were tense. Her eyes were tired. She seemed less like a successful executive and more like someone who had spent years running from her own reflection. Graham spoke first. You've already taken enough from us. His voice was calm, but beneath it lay decades of pain. A faded blue blanket remained folded across the sofa. For a moment, it almost felt as though he might walk through the kitchen door carrying a cup of tea. Brooke looked around the room with visible emotion. He made this house feel warm. He did, I answered. She closed her eyes before continuing. When Graham and Julian fell in love, our family was in crisis. Graham stared at her without speaking. Our father's company was close to bankruptcy. Investors were already questioning every decision Graham made. She swallowed carefully. You convinced yourself, Graham interrupted quietly, that you had the right to decide my future. Tears gathered in Brooke's eyes. Instead, she reached into her handbag and removed a worn leather folder. I kept everything. Inside were copies of letters, bank receipts, private notes. Each document told another painful piece of the same. She admitted hiring someone to intercept their mail. She admitted sending false letters in Graham's name. She admitted visiting Julian herself while pretending to protect Graham's reputation. I told him you had chosen your career. My heart sank. I told him you wanted a respectable public life. Graham closed his eyes. And he believed you. Yes. She began crying openly. I never imagined either of you would spend your lives apart. You imagined exactly that, Graham answered. You simply believed time would erase it. The room fell silent again. I looked toward the photographs resting on the bookshelf. One decision. A handful of lies. 26 years of loneliness. The cost suddenly felt impossible to measure. Brooke slowly turned toward me. There is something your father never knew. I met her eyes. What? The day Julian left the city. She paused, fighting her emotions. Graham had already bought the engagement ring. I looked toward Graham. He quietly reached into his coat pocket. Without speaking, he placed the small silver ring on the coffee table. Brooke covered her mouth. You still have it. I never stopped hope. And Nolan grew up without. Brooke lowered her head.
I'm sorry.
For the first time, I believed she truly understood what those years had cost. The following morning, Graham asked if I would accompany him somewhere. Neither of us needed to say where. The cemetery rested on a quiet hillside overlooking a small lake. Morning sunlight filtered gently through rows of old oak trees. Birdsong drifted through the cool air. My father's grave was simple. A gray stone. His favorite flower. Graham stopped several feet away. For a long time he couldn't move. His hands shook as he held the silver ring. Finally he walked forward. He knelt slowly before the headstone. Hello, Julian. His voice almost disappeared. "I'm late." Tears slipped quietly down his face. "So much later than I promised." I remained a respectful distance behind him. This moment belonged to them. He spoke for several minutes. He apologized for believing lies. He thanked Julian for every memory they had shared. He laughed softly while remembering the library where they first met. He admitted that no success, no award, and no fortune had ever replaced what they lost. Then he gently placed the old photograph beside the flowers. The same photograph that had brought us together. "I carried this with me every day," he whispered. "I think it belongs with you now." The breeze lifted slightly, rustling the nearby trees. For reasons I couldn't explain, the silence no longer felt heavy. Felt peaceful. As though two hearts separated for decades had finally spoken the words they never had the chance to say. When Graham stood, his expression had changed. The sadness remained. Probably always would. But beneath it rested something new. Acceptance. As we turned to leave, he looked toward the lake where sunlight shimmered across the water. "There was a time," he said quietly, "when I believed the future had ended." He smiled gently. "Now I think Julian gave me one final gift." I looked at him. "What gift?" He placed a hand on my shoulder with quiet warmth. "The chance to make sure his kindness doesn't disappear with us." I frowned slightly. "I don't understand." "You will." He looked back at Julian's grave one last time. "There's one promise I still want to keep." The calm certainty in his voice told me this wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of the life Julian had always hoped someone would choose in his memory. Graham nodded. "That sounds exactly like him." When we reached the city, he didn't drive toward Mercer Holdings. Instead, he stopped outside a modest brick building that overlooked a quiet neighborhood park. A small sign rested above the entrance. "Future Horizons Community Center." Children's laughter drifted through the open windows. Teenagers were painting murals inside one room while volunteers served lunch in another. I looked at Graham. "You own this place?" He smiled. "But today, I'd like to do something different." Inside, the center felt warm and welcoming. Books lined one wall. Old couches surrounded a reading corner. Every face we passed greeted Graham by his first name rather than by his title. That surprised me more than anything. A little boy ran over and hugged his leg. "Mr. Graham, you came back." "I promised I would." He gently ruffled the child's hair. Watching him, I realized the newspapers had never truly described the man standing beside me. They knew his fortune. They didn't know his heart. After the children returned to their activities, Graham led me into a quiet meeting room. A folder waited on the table. Across the front was a simple title: The Julian Hayes Foundation. For years, I had believed my future would never stretch beyond restaurant shifts and late-night buses home. Now someone believed I could become part of something larger. Not because of my last name, because of who I was. Several weeks passed. Life slowly found a new rhythm. I still worked at Hawthorne House while helping Graham prepare the foundation. Every evening we sorted old journals, selected scholarships, and planned community programs. Sometimes we laughed over stories about my father's terrible singing. Sometimes silence said everything. Neither of us tried to replace the man we had lost. We simply carried him forward together. Even Brooke changed. She never asked for forgiveness again. Instead, she volunteered quietly. She funded art programs under Julian's name without placing her own name on a single plaque. One afternoon, I found her arranging books inside the community center's library. She looked embarrassed when she noticed me. "I don't expect anyone to forget what I did." She nodded. "I know." After a long pause, I added quietly, "But people can choose what they become next." Her eyes filled with tears. "Do you really believe that?" "My father did." She smiled through those tears. "Thank you." Months later, Hawthorne House hosted a charity dinner celebrating the official opening of the Julian Hayes Foundation. The ballroom glowed beneath hundreds of tiny lights. Musicians played soft piano melodies. Teachers, students, business leaders, neighbors. They all gathered for the same reason: hope. Near the entrance stood a large framed portrait of my father. It was the same photograph that had once rested in Graham's office. Only now it belonged to everyone. Guests stopped to read the simple words beneath it: "Kindness leaves echoes that outlive us all." As the evening drew to a close, Graham stepped onto the small stage. He adjusted the microphone before looking across the room. Years earlier, public speeches had been easy for him. Tonight was different. Tonight, every word came from his heart. "I spent many years believing love had abandoned me." The room became completely silent. "I've learned something very different." He smiled toward me. "Real love asks us to become better people. It asks us to protect one another. And when we fail," he paused, "it quietly waits for us to find our way home." Applause filled the room. I finally understood something my father had tried to teach me without ever saying the words aloud. Love does not disappear because time passes. It does not vanish because fear wins for a while. It waits inside every act of kindness, every honest apology, every hand offered to someone standing alone. The greatest gift my father left behind wasn't a secret. It wasn't a photograph. It wasn't even the truth we uncovered. It was the reminder that a gentle heart can change lives long after it stops beating. As Graham and I walked away from the restaurant together, neither of us tried to leave the past behind. Instead, we carried it with us, not as a burden, but as a promise. A promise that no lie would ever silence love again. And somewhere beyond the city's lights, I like to believe Julian Hayes was finally at peace, knowing that the love he thought he had lost had become the hope that would guide countless others toward a brighter tomorrow.